Hello, Anastasia and I are here to talk to you about the years following Impressionism, specifically Symbolism and Post-Impressionism, as well as Neo-Impressionism. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Looks like it's just me. Anastasia has left. So for starters, we're going to start with Symbolism. Symbolism starts earlier than Post-Impressionism and Neo-Impressionism, but a lot of Neo-Impressionism and Symbolism and Post-Impressionism are occurring simultaneously. And so it's important to understand that they influence each other, but they often overlap significantly, particularly in terms of a timeline. So what we're looking at is Orpheus by Gustave Moreau from 1865. And this is an example of a symbolist painting. So symbolism originates in France, and it's initially defined as a literary movement. And basically, it's a combination of philosophy, mystical and occult doctrine, psychology, linguistics, science, political theory, and aesthetic issues. So there's a lot going into it, and it is very, very educated, right? And the basic notion is that there's another world beyond the world of just appearances. Basically, it's a symbolic use of objects to express underlying ideas and emotions, as well as reacting against the growing materialism of the age. So it aims to reconcile spirit and matter through language of signs and hidden meanings. So these works are only fully understood by the unofficial brotherhood of symbolists' self-defined dream world. Okay, so we're looking specifically at a dream world, and there's this belief in correspondence between the external form and the subjective state. And it's not new ideas that are being put forward, but rather a very eclectic or kind of random use of traditions in art, religion, and occult. So it's often seeking to reconcile modern science with spiritual traditions. And they view it as the realm of psychic experience, promising access to realms of knowledge. So they're often very educated topics. So Orpheus is from Greek and Roman mythology, okay? And Moreau is known as a symbolist. And I believe I have several Moreau paintings here to show you. Okay, so here is Oedipus and the Sphinx. Okay, but you can see that there is a specific style that is going on here. There's a lot of detail that is perhaps not explained. This is a great example. So this is Jupiter and Semele. Okay, so it is mythological, but do you see how incredibly detailed everything is? Everything has a meaning. Okay, nothing is here randomly. And so it's this combination of aesthetic effect as well as, do you see how this is a rather Renaissance or late medieval figure? So it's combining mysticism as well as education and learning and knowledge. And it has this rather hazy, dreamlike appearance to the works. And this is characteristic of all of them, for the most part. So it stresses feeling over fact and definition. So it's the power of suggestion. So here's an example called Galatea by Gustave Moreau, and it's 1896. And we see here Galatea, who is resting while she's being watched by Polyphemus, who's a cyclops or has one eye. Okay, but even now, it's not just a woman with a man in the background. There's all this intricate work. And it believes that this movement believes that empirical science leaves no room for the spirit. And spiritual insights can be obtained via intuition, fantasy, imagination, and experiences like dreams, visions, and hypnotism. So it's kind of rooted in Romanticism. And then we see some of these same tendencies once again when Surrealism comes to the surface. Sorry about that. So you can kind of see how these images are somewhat similar. There's this very dreamlike state. And this is called the apparition. And this is actually Salome. So if you remember the stick figure life of Christ, this is Salome after her dance, and this is the head of John the Baptist. So do you see how late Gothic, early Renaissance, this halo, and just the very way everything is depicted, okay? So this is a very important movement for many of the Post-Impressionists. So before we move into Post-Impressionism, however, I want to show you Neo-Impressionism. So again, the word neo means new. And this term is coined by a critic at the last Impressionist exhibit in 1886. So the critic saw Impressionism, so think Monet, as being instinctive and spontaneous, whereas Neo-Impressionism, what we're seeing here, which is Seurat's A Sunday on Le Grand Jardin, from 1884 to 1886. And this is at the Chicago Art Institute. I would strongly recommend visiting if you get the chance. Neo-Impressionism is based on reflection and permanence, and it's developed both from and in reaction to Impressionism. So they feel that Impressionism is too spontaneous, too improvisational. And so there are many of the same concerns going into Neo-Impressionism. So this concern with capturing a fleeting moment, the middle class, an afternoon of leisure, but it's a much more rational and scientific method. So what we're seeing here is called pointillism. And this is the practice of applying pure dots of color of equal size to give an effect of luminosity. Okay, so you can see how there's this small unadulterated blue mixed in with the green and the yellow, and you can see these dots. Okay, so this is pioneered by Seurat, the artist who created this work. And pointillism, as I said, is small dots rather than brush strokes, and the size of the dots are determined by the size of the picture. You also see divisionism, which is the use of pure colors rather than mixing pigments. And you'll see these used in combination with each other. So the idea with divisionism is that the eye will mix the colors when they're placed in small areas next to each other, rather than having to mix the colors as the artist. And this achieves maximum of luminosity with saturation of color, as it is an additive rather than subtractive method. So this is very focused on color theory, okay? But it is not a new technique. But I want you to think about Impressionism and how that's capturing a fleeting moment, and the how quickly these works were painted, right? And the fact that they're painted en plein air, right? Which means out in the open, versus the work that would go into a Neo-Impressionist work, such as this one. And you can see that even the frame is painted by Seurat. Okay, so it's no wonder this took 2 years. It's extremely time consuming. And another way that this is different from Impressionism is that Impressionists use wet paint on top of wet paint in order to capture atmosphere and changing conditions of light. But the Neo-Impressionists are painting on dry areas of canvas. And the picture is deliberately planned and composed. So you can see here, this is a study for the previous work. So Le Grand Jardin by Seurat. And you can see how this is much more impressionist. The strokes are much bigger. It's obviously capturing light at just an intangible moment, right? And so you can see how Impressionism is influencing Le Grand Jardin. But in the end, Seurat takes it in a much more scientific and mathematical and logical direction. Again, this is a really great example of pointillism, and this is at the DIA. And look at the size of these dots, okay? It's a ton of dots. It's a ton of work. So the Neo-Impressionists, they hold that their art is innovative enough to bring about the downfall of the status quo. And therefore they would help to create a new society. But they're not particularly militant about it. They're not super pushy and aggressive about Neo-Impressionism. And Seurat actually dies quite young. He died, I think, at 32. So he dies in 1891. And sadly, after he dies, Pissarro, who was an impressionist, takes up Neo-Impressionism when Seurat starts to do this type of painting. Pissarro, after Seurat's death, is like, holy crap, this is really tedious. And he just completely abandons Neo-Impressionism. So Neo-Impressionism effectively dies with Seurat. But again, right, you can understand where Pissarro is coming from. Think about the amount of scientific consideration of color theory and just the sheer amount of time this would take to create. But again, right, similar concerns to Impressionists in that it's capturing just an everyday moment. So here we see a performer and a sideshow on the street who is playing an instrument, and you see the crowd watching. So this is nothing special, right? This is not something that merits a grand portrait. This is just an example of everyday life. It's very similar to Degas' pictures of the ballet, but again, approached much more scientifically and rationally. So those are some Neo-Impressionist works. Moving on to Post-Impressionism. So out of Impressionism in the 1880s, you get two main groups. You get Divisionism, which we just saw with this dividing the colors, right, and creating these intricate dots of pure colors that are not mixed, as well as Synthetism. And I'm going to get into Synthetism in a few minutes here. But these artists, both groups, are reacting not against the Impressionist artists, but against the trope of Impressionism as an unthinking practice. So Impressionism might seem like it's much lighter and more carefree than other work, but it is actually very concerned with some scientific effects, like the effects of light and atmosphere and the changing of the seasons and color theory, right? So there is an intellectual underpinning to this. So Post-Impressionism tries to blur the line. So Impressionism is seen as a development that threatens the intellectual basis of art, blurring the line between artist and nature, a preparatory work versus a finished work. And it's seen as having devalued compositions in its haste to capture impermanent and superficial effects. So with Post-Impressionism, the period following Impressionism, so post is after, we start to see the reassertion of the artist's role, and we start to see more distance from the subject matter, as well as a clear distinction between preparatory works and finished works. So the artists are imposing an emotional distance between themselves and the subject. And we see a renewed emphasis on drawing as a preliminary stage, as opposed to simply going out into the open and painting, right? Also with Post-Impressionism, we see the introduction of objective distortion. So this is distortion deliberately calculated to create a decorative effect. So it's not simply expressing subjective feelings about nature, but also imposing a style over it. And there are deeper meanings and personal feelings that become valid subjects in this time period. And abstract concerns of harmony and two-dimensional arrangements of form are more important than naturalism. So we can see this here with Cézanne's apples from 1878. Okay, so we're looking at 7 spheres, but these are not modeled using light and dark smoothly rolling over into the other to create this sense of form. We are seeing these essentially planes of color is what it amounts to. So if you look, right, Obviously, we have these individual brush strokes, but there are also these little squares or rectangles of color that are put together to build the shape. So the color is being used to construct shape. Okay, and you can also see that the perspective is a bit askew. Apologies. So we're seeing some of these apples at an angle, whereas some of them are much more a straight view. And this is intentional. This is not an example of an artist who does not know how to effectively create the sense of form and weight, but this is an intentional distortion. And Post-Impressionism lasts from roughly 1886, which is the year of the last Impressionist exhibit, until 1905, which is when Fauvism appears, and then there's a move towards Cubism. And I get into Fauvism in the next lecture. Post-Impressionism is predominantly French, and it rejects the Impressionists' concern for naturalistic depiction of light and color, favoring instead emphasis on abstract qualities or symbolic content. So this is Basket of Apples, and you can see how the perspective is incredibly askew. Okay, so the table, it should be much more of an oblique angle towards the table, but here we see that it's very slanted, it's very diagonal. And if you look here at the bottom, you can see that the, here we go, this one's better. You can see that the edge of the table does not line up the way that it should. So here on the left-hand side, we see the table, and then there's this huge jump backwards, and then the edge of the table is here. And this is intentional. This is to create a sense that you are viewing this object from more than one viewpoint, okay? And something that is noteworthy about the Post-Impressionists is that there is no cohesive style. It's more concerns with certain effects and depicting certain emotions, etc., than it is a distinct style. And it's inspired by the symbolist movement in literature. So Post-Impressionists consider Impressionists too naturalistic. So it looks too much like nature, right? They're depicting things in a realistic way, too realistic for the Post-Impressionists. So interestingly enough, in the countries that do not have a strong Impressionist movement, you do not see Post-Impressionism nearly as strongly. Okay, so again, look at these apples. And look at the way that the form is constructed by the use of color rather than modeling. Okay, so they are basically taking Impressionism's experiments and pushing them further. Okay, so just pushing the envelope a bit more. So instead of a spectacle of the external world like we've seen last week with the Impressionists, the Post-Impressionists are looking at an expression of internal psychology of the individual. And you want to move away from the complexity of appearance to the geometrical simplicity which design demands. So Cézanne is really, really crucial to Post-Impressionism. Okay, and what we're seeing here is Mont Saint-Victoire, and this is a specific mountain in France. Let me search for this title. And this is it. So this is a specific mountain that Cézanne paints over and over and over. So in that way, it is similar to the way the Impressionists painted the same cathedral facade or haystacks over and over, right? But you can see the way that the form is built with these planes of color, okay? Very important. So Cezanne believed that Impressionists ignored the tenets of traditional Western painting, and Cezanne takes it further. He wants to, quote, make of the Impressionists something solid like the art of museums. And he takes this very literally. He wants to invent a new way of painting solid forms that does not rely on one point perspective. Okay, and so here the interest is in the juxtaposition of colors and brushstrokes rather than the accurate depiction of trees and a mountain. So he uses tonal variations to create dimension. He does not use light or shadow, but rather gradations of color. The important thing to remember about Cezanne is that he is interested in depicting how our eyes perceive the world as we move through it, rather than a fixed perspective that you might expect from a painting. Okay, so I'm going to say that again. How our eyes see the world as we move through it, rather than of a fixed perspective. And this is why you have multiple perspectives at once. This is particularly noticeable in Cezanne's still lifes. But again, you can see how this is coming into play in his work. And this is an earlier work, but just to kind of give you an idea of what his landscapes look like before he takes it to the extreme that we just saw with some of his Mont Saint-Victoire, like here or here. This one's incredibly abstracted. The yellow indicates houses, but they don't look like houses, right? It's just an idea of a house. And he is also known for his depictions of bathers. So again, right, we see this outlining of the figures in black. And this is something that's going to come up again and I'll get into. But the figures themselves are not modeled like we would expect. And the trees and the sky, right? All of it's kind of blending together because of the way that form is created. All right, on from Cezanne to Van Gogh. So here we have an early Van Gogh. This is 1885, early-ish Van Gogh. And this is called The Potato Eaters. And Van Gogh is very interested in depicting life around him, life as he sees it. And he is incredibly empathetic to the poor. And so what we see here is his depiction of the poor who have nothing to eat but potatoes. And potatoes are seen as very low-class food. And these peasants have nothing but potatoes to eat. And you can see how rough his forms are, his outlines, as well as his use of color. But Van Gogh is well known for the brighter colors that we're more accustomed to. So he uses bright, unmodulated color that he chooses to express how he feels. So he says, quote, instead of trying to reproduce exactly what I have before my eyes, I use color more arbitrarily to express myself forcibly, end quote. And unlike some of the other artists that we see today, such as Cezanne, he never actually fully abandons perspective. Okay, and you can see how he's really just kind of combining all of these colors together, and the loose way that the paint is applied, as well as the fact that it's kind of scraped onto the canvas. There's often a lot of impasto. This is a self-portrait of Van Gogh. It's actually at the DIA, and Van Gogh depicted himself over and over and over. In part because he wanted sitters, and the cheapest sitter is himself, right? The cheapest model is himself. And so here you can kind of see some of the interest in the way the color is maintained as a pure color and juxtaposed next to other colors in order to make it really pop. And so he really, really loves these bright, bright colors. I don't know if anyone watches Doctor Who, but there's actually a really good episode on Van Gogh. In terms of Doctor Who episodes, specifically, like, you know, defeating the bad guys and chasing monsters through space and time, not great. But in terms of Van Gogh and really helping you to kind of empathize with this man, it is really good. I cry every time I see it. And Van Gogh struggled with mental health issues. And so his painting was really soulless to him. But like the Impressionists, he would paint very quickly, and he would paint numerous versions of the same thing. And you can see that he really likes these bright colors. So here he depicts sunflowers, and this is a common theme for him. And you can see the impasto. So the impasto, if you don't remember, is the buildup of paint on the canvas so that it actually stands out from the canvas. And again, you can see the colors are very shrill and acidic. Okay, his chair. And so he was actually friends with Gauguin, and he really wanted to have a good relationship with Gauguin, but Van Gogh was not easy to get along with, and Gauguin, and it didn't end well. So this is Van Gogh's painting of his chair and Gauguin's chair. So you can see that he's trying to depict their different personalities, okay? And he often includes these halos of light. And this could have had to do with an illness that he had. So there are a lot of different reasons for this, but some of these are actually very accurate depictions. And again, you can see how he's depicting the same subject matter in different ways. I'll come back to that one. So Starry Night, this is one that everybody knows, right? But the thing is, it looks completely fantastical, but they're able to identify the location of the stars on roughly the night that he painted this, and it is accurate. So he is using this this movement, this wild, frenzied movement, and these halos surrounding these stars to express feeling and emotion. Okay, but again, the halos could also be something that he literally saw because of the way that he perceived the world. But again, right, these very frenzied brushstrokes, very, very thick paint. And he was known to do more than one painting a day. This painting is very famous. Some people say that it's his last work, but that's actually not true. But what's interesting here is that it doesn't have a vanishing point in the distance, right? If you track where the orthogonals are, they actually start at the viewer and they move out. So it's a reversal of one-point perspective. So instead of like this, it comes at you like this. And so you can see how this is influenced by the Impressionists, right? The loose brush strokes, the unmodulated color. He would paint en plein air. He would paint out in the open. But you can see that there's more to it. This is not simply interested in the effects of light and modernity, but this is evincing emotion. Hopefully you're picking up on that. He was also heavily influenced by Japonism, which I mentioned last week, I believe, and that is the influence of Japanese prints on Western art at the time. Up next is Gauguin, and Gauguin feels that an emotional response to nature is much more important than the intellectual response, and he's closely related with the symbolists. He feels that lines and colors and numbers communicate meaning, and intuition is crucial to artistic creation. And he thinks that ideas and feelings derived from nature should be conveyed in the simplest of forms. And he develops synthetism. So this is clear outlines to define areas of color arranged in flat planes. So what we're looking at here is a depiction of women who are praying and witnessing a vision. So this is called The Vision After the Sermon by Gauguin from 1888. And Gauguin is very interested in what's known as the primitive. And this is something that I'm going to get into in the next lecture, but basically it's this idea that in order to really tap into emotions and the spirit and the spiritual, you need to go outside of Western civilization and get in touch with people who are not as civilized. So this manifests with Gauguin eventually going to Tahiti. Let me get there. Yes, Tahiti, because he feels that the people there are more in touch with their primal selves, etc. But he starts by going to Brittany in France, where the people have a slightly more medieval mindset, and there's this very strong religious devotion. And so what you see here is these women praying, and you can see that they're outlined in black. And their prayer has conjured up a vision of Jacob wrestling with an angel, which is a biblical story from the Old Testament. But you can see how this flat background just really compresses everything. And the women are kneeling on it, and yet it's before them. So there's this distortion of perspective. And Gauguin believes that synthetism, that art should be a synthesis or a combination of three features: the outward appearance of natural form, the artist's feeling about the subject, and aesthetic considerations of line, color, and form. So although he uses real objects or people as a starting point, he then distorts them to more clearly express certain moods and interpretations. Okay, and so Gauguin is really very interested in symbolism. He's very invested in it. And so he also is interested in the decorative. But to show you what I mean about the outlines defining areas of flat color, right? You can see how he has outlined his ear, his jaw, his mouth, right? The side of its face. And then you have this very flat background. And this is something that we see with artists like Hende Wiley, where there's this interest in the background and the foreground merging through use of decorative elements. And so this wallpaper is really coming forward and almost merging with him. There's very little depth in this painting. And this is Self-Portrait with Portrait of Emile Bernard, Les Miserables, from 1888 by Gauguin. And so we see a repetition of colors across the canvas to create harmonious rhythm. We see extremely defined forms that are either outlined or juxtaposed, and this creates a lot of rhythm. And there's this emphasis on a flat arrangement of lines and colors. The art is seen as a form of language. And Gauguin is envious of the natural spirituality of the uneducated native peoples who are distant from modern decadent society. So again, right here we see the women of Brittany praying before a vision of Jesus crucified on the cross. And you can see how this is really a throwback to a medieval crucifix here. But it's juxtaposed against this landscape. And so he is trying to recreate these elemental forms of communication using primitive artistic achievements. So again, right, this symbolism. And so this is self-portrait. And here we see the snake and apples. So this is referencing Adam and Eve and the fall of mankind. Excuse me. And we also see this very odd little halo, right? And the fact that this hand is outlined but completely flattened. So again, it's more interested in expressing an emotion than it is with accurate representation of the natural object. Landscapes, and again, he's best known for his Tahitian paintings. So this one is, the translated title is By the Sea from 1892. And he is incredibly preoccupied with Tahitian women. So Gauguin is, he's very avant-garde in his sensibilities and his aesthetics. You can see it here in the water, which has these multicolored, abstract, very flat planes. But Gauguin is a very problematic person. So not only is he viewing these people as less than, as primitive and uneducated, but he also, and I'll come back to that one, he also takes as his mistress, I believe, 13-year-old Tahitian girl. So there's a lot of sexual exploitation that goes on in his life and his work. He actually, I believe he was, I want to say, a banker or stockbroker in France, and he had a wife and children, and he abandoned them to go paint. And then he moved to Tahiti, and he got his 13-year-old mistress pregnant. And so what we see here is her lying on the bed crying as she is menaced by a crow. And it says "Nevermore." That's the title. So for those of you who are familiar with Edgar Allan Poe, this is The Raven from Poe's The Raven. And so the reason that this girl is so discombobulated is because there is this, there's more mysticism in the culture at the time in Tahiti. And she really believes that this is the spirits of the dead menacing her. But again, extremely problematic in his sexual exploitation of women, his cavalier treatment of actual human beings that just don't rate as highly as he does. He is incredibly narcissistic. This is a very famous painting called Where Do We Come From? What Are We? Where Are We Going? And this is kind of a life cycle. So we have infants, and we have children and adults, and then finally we have old age and decrepit individual. And she is actually based on a mummy of a curled up person. So he's really interested in these non-Western mystical influences. Okay, Toulouse-Lautrec. This is another post-impressionist artist, and he is very, very focused on the nightlife in Paris. So he's a very different, goes in a very different direction from Gauguin, but again, he is interested in some of the same subject matter as the Impressionists, but he's more interested in capturing an emotion, right, a feeling, than he is in accurately depicting something or even capturing things like light. So this print is called Jane Avril, and it's from 1893. And Jane is a very popular dancer who does the can-can. So the can-can is a dance that involves kicking your legs. You go like do, 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 do. And it's very risque at the time. And so she is this burlesque dancer, essentially. But you can see how the artist is influenced by Japanism, the Japanese prints, right? So the flattening, look at how flat this skirt is. The only indication of depth is this single line, right? And the face become almost caricatures. And so he depicts the Paris nightlife, and his depictions might seem somewhat cruel, but they're not. So we see here another dancer, and he loved to go to the Moulin Rouge, and he would depict the women there. But he depicts many of these women as humans worthy of dignity. So here we see a work called The Two Friends from 1895, and he's actually depicting prostitutes. And he just very matter-of-factly depicts what's going on in their life. But you can see the loose brush strokes and the semi-decorative patterning. There is some heightening of colors. So this is the somewhat unnatural colors in the skin tones, etc. Here's another dancer. And we see her engaged in this Spanish style dance that really showed off the legs. So this would be rather risque. And there's this very eerie effect to many of his paintings. And he often lights them from underneath. So the chins are very brightly lit in this rather sickly green color, and the rest of the face is cast into shadow. Okay. And he takes people's features and he pushes them a little bit farther, almost towards a caricature, but not quite there. This painting I really love, and the English title is Medical Inspection. And so what we see here are prostitutes who are lined up, and there's I believe monthly inspection of them to ensure that they do not have STDs, because prostitutes needed to be, not transmitting sexual diseases. And so he depicts them as they wait in line with their genitals exposed, but he does it in a very matter-of-fact and almost compassionate way. He's not presenting these as caricatures. He's not presenting them as fallen women for us to moralize on. He's simply very matter-of-factly presenting them as they are. And he's depicting a seamy side of life that most, if they might not see it, but also a lot of men would go to Moulin Rouge, and they would see this, but you wouldn't necessarily admit that you saw this. So this is not the sexy dancer doing her erotic dance. This is just the practicality of being a prostitute. And this is at the Moulin Rouge. So again, we have this very eerie effect of the underlighting and then this very teal color. And in the background, we can see, yes, okay, I couldn't remember which of the two figures he was. But in the background, we actually see him. And so he treats himself the same way he treats everyone else. He's this very short figure here. And this is his friend or cousin, I believe. But again, right, these very shrill colors, the perspective that is off, this depiction of modern life, of modernity. And I believe we're going to look at Munch and then Rodin and call it. So Munch is another post-impressionist, and he is also a symbolist. So there is meaning behind what his images depict. So here we see it's titled Jealousy. And so there's a woman in the background, and this man is green with jealousy. And Munch had a lot of mental health issues. He's best known for the Scream, but Munch really, really depicted angst. So angst is the German word for anxiety, but Munch had a rough start in life, and his mother died, and I believe his sister died, and he was very traumatized by these things. And so he would often feel like the world was kind of closing in on him. So that's what we're seeing here with the Scream. And I believe I have yes, here we go. So Munch was out walking, and he says, quote, "I was out walking with two friends. The sun was setting. Suddenly, the sky turned blood red. I paused, feeling exhausted, and leaned on the fence. There was blood and tongues of fire above the blue-black fjord and the city. My friends walked on, and I stood there trembling with angst, and I sensed an endless scream passing through nature." So very disquieting, angst-ridden pieces. And this is going to be very important for the expressionists who are discussed in the next lecture. But again, you can see the sick child. And so this is his depiction of a child who is dying, right? This is referencing his beloved sister who died as a child. And he also had a lot of anxiety surrounding women. So he had an unfortunate experience with a woman that he was in love with, and it really kind of turned him against women. And he starts to see them as all being femme fatales. So a femme fatale is a beautiful woman who is heartless, and she is very dangerous, right? So fatale, femme fatale is basically dangerous woman. Who they just want to play with your heart and stomp on it. And very, very vicious and very seductive. So a great example of a femme fatale is actually Salome, because she uses her beauty to enable the beheading of John the Baptist. And the symbolists are also very preoccupied with femme fatales. Okay. So this is called the vampire, and it's something between a hug and a kiss and a draining of energy from this formless, faceless man. So again, right, very angst-ridden. Finally, I want to talk about Rodin, and he is a sculptor. He worked in conjunction with his student Camille Claudel, with whom he had a relationship. And I want to say that Camille Claudel actually did quite a lot with his work. It's not clear how much is her work versus his work. He would take credit for her work because she was a student and she was female, but primarily because she was female. But his interest is in capturing in sculpture a moment, right? So he often captures like a figure walking. And you can see how this is very uneven. So these would be made in clay before they would be cast in metal. And so you can see how lumpy and uneven the surface is here. You can often see handprints or fingerprints in these works, and then they're cast into the metal. But there is this focus on the musculature and how the body moves through time and space, as well as an emphasis on emotion and feeling. Okay, and so this is not that it's incomplete, right? There is no crack between the buttocks. I was hoping I wouldn't have to actually say that. And this is not because it's unfinished, but because this is his style of working. He's well known for the burghers of Calais. So these are men who, to save their city, they volunteer to go forth and be sacrificed and bring the key of the city in order to save the people of the city from starving during a long siege. And so you can see their resignation, and they know that they're going to die, and they're accepting of this, but you can see how rough the surface is. So basically what we're looking at is the sculptural equivalent of impasto. And like some of the other artists that we've seen, the hands are oversized, the feet are oversized. There's just this real sense of humanity. Spoiler alert, the burghers of Calais were spared, but they didn't know that. And so this is his work, and his figures are often over life size. And he's very well known for the gates of hell. This is at the Musée d'Orsay, and this is exactly what it sounds like. It's a depiction of what the gates to hell would look like, but it's believed that Camille Claudel actually did a lot of this work, and the Thinker is his most famous sculpture. He's extremely well known for it. There's actually one of the Thinkers in front of the DIA on Woodward, and it comes from the gates of hell. But it's likely that Camille Claudel actually was the one responsible for the forms. So I'm going to wrap it up there. Anastasia has come back, and I will call it a night. So hopefully this was educational. Bye.